Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night.
The ocean was calm the morning we slipped beneath the surface. Calm in a way that felt unnatural, like the sea itself was holding its breath. I stood at the rail of the Calypso Reach, gripping the cold steel as I watched the descent chamber being sealed. I've studied bathymetric maps and sonar readouts my whole life, tracing trenches into black infinity, but nothing, no chart, no reading, prepares you for the sensation of willingly stepping into something that could crush you without effort. "Final checks complete," Harlan's voice came through the intercom. "You're clear to detach." The chamber shuddered as the last restraints released. For a moment it floated like a weightless corpse, and then the ballast engaged and the ocean reclaimed it. Sunlight fractured around the viewport, bending in ways that made my stomach twist. At first, the dive was beautiful. Sunlight filtered down in fading beams, illuminating drifting particles that looked like snow suspended in midair. Schools of fish scattered at our approach, silver flashes vanishing into the blue. I watched automatically, monitoring oxygen, hull integrity, and pressure, everything nominal. This wasn't a record-breaking dive, it was reconnaissance. Months ago, deep-sea sensors had picked up something in the trench we were descending, a seismic anomaly. Not tectonic, not biological, but something else. Something the charts couldn't explain. By 1,200 meters, the last sunlight disappeared. Our floodlights clicked on, illuminating only the particles drifting downward endlessly. The silence hit me first. Not the absence of sound. Machines hummed, water pressed against the hull, but the absence of life. Nothing moved. Nothing existed beyond the chamber. "Status check," Harlan said. "All systems green," I replied. There was a pause. "Sonar's acting up," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "Pings coming back delayed, warped, like the sound's bending." "That's impossible," I said. "Water density doesn't change like that at this depth." "I know," Harlan said quietly. "That's why I'm telling you." At 2,400 meters, I saw it. A shadow passed beneath the lights. Not a creature, not fast, just a curve sliding along in ways nothing alive should move. The lights caught nothing, only darkness pressing against darkness. "Did you see that?" I asked. "I didn't," Harlan said. I stared a moment longer, heart hammering. Never mind. But my hand stayed pressed to the viewport. Something was down there, watching, waiting. The deeper we went, the heavier it felt. Not in my body, but in my mind. The chamber's thrusters hummed as we drifted, but the abyss below seemed to resist. Shadows flickered at the edge of the floodlights, shapes that shouldn't exist. I couldn't tell if they were real or if the ocean was playing tricks on my mind. "Sonar's unstable," Harlan said. "We're getting returns where there shouldn't be anything." I glanced at the screens. Faint outlines formed and dissolved before I could focus on them. Something huge moved beneath us, but every time I tried to track it, it vanished. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The trench wasn't empty. It was alive, patient, curious. At 3,100 meters, the chamber passed a thermal boundary. The temperature dropped sharply, condensation forming along the seams. I wiped at the viewport, but it felt pointless. Outside, the abyss stretched endlessly, a void that didn't obey the laws of physics. Then I saw the trench. Not a slope, not a wall, a gaping hole, blacker than the surrounding darkness, falling into nothing. Particles vanished as they crossed it, swallowed. "Visual on the trench," I said. "I see it," Harlan replied. "Sensors are going crazy, dead zones everywhere."
It was at the edge of that void I felt it, the pull, a subtle awareness pressing at me, testing me, like standing at the edge of a cliff that wanted to know if I'd jump. Movement flickered in the black. It wasn't swimming. It didn't rise. It folded in on itself, then expanded again. The trench itself seemed to breathe. "It moved," I said. "I know," Harlan whispered, "and I don't like it." The sonar spiked, then flatlined. For a long moment, nothing. Then it returned, violently, a pressure wave rattling the chamber. The lights flickered, the hull vibrated faintly. Something had acknowledged us. Something was aware. I could feel it now. The trench pressed not on the chamber, but on me. The darkness was patient, deliberate, testing me. Shadows moved at impossible speeds along the walls, curving and folding, vanishing before I could comprehend them. "Do you feel that?" I whispered. Harlan's voice was tight. "Yeah, like it's thinking about us." I gripped the viewport harder. Sonar blipped nonsensically. Particles swirled against currents, patterns too complex to be random. Something enormous lurked beneath, unseen yet aware. At 3,700 meters, time distorted. Seconds stretched into minutes. My stomach clenched. The chamber trembled slightly, responding to a touch I couldn't feel. The trench wasn't just alive, it was conscious. A shadow brushed the edge of our lights, immense and coiling, not aggressive, observant, calculating. I pressed my forehead against the glass. The sensation was like being examined by a predator older than humanity itself. "It's awake," Harlan said softly. "Yes," I replied, "and it knows we're here." At 4,000 meters, the chamber shivered again. The trench expanded beneath us, its walls vanishing into impossible angles. The abyss was bending perception. Particles moved with intent. Shadows wrapped around the chamber like invisible hands. The pull inside my chest grew stronger. Every instinct screamed to ascend, but curiosity rooted me in place. I felt the trench assessing me, weighing me, understanding me. Harlan's voice broke through my thoughts. "Depth check. Do you feel that tug?" "Yes," I admitted. "It's aware of us." The shadow appeared again, immense, curving around the chamber, following our movement with unnatural precision. My pulse matched its rhythm. I realized then, the trench could touch minds, manipulate perception, and wait patiently. It wasn't indifferent anymore. It had acknowledged us, and it was patient. The deeper we went, the heavier it felt, not just physically, but in my chest, in my mind. The chamber's thrusters hummed against the crushing black, but it was like the abyss had its own presence, subtly resisting, weighing, testing us. "Something's shifting," I whispered, my hand gripping the rail so tightly it ached. Shadows flickered at the edges of the floodlights, shapes curling along the trench walls, moving in ways no current or fish could explain. Harlan's voice was taut in my ear. "I see it, and it's huge, beyond comprehension." My stomach tightened. The shadow moved again, slow, deliberate, bending around the chamber's light. I realized it wasn't hunting, not yet, but it was aware, watching, curious. A low hum vibrated through the hull, barely audible but felt in my bones. My mind tried to rationalize it. It can't be alive. Yet every instinct screamed the opposite. The abyss pulsed in response to us, or maybe to my fear. The chamber felt small. My hands shook. I pressed my forehead to the viewport. The trench was not empty. It was patient, intelligent, and waiting. By 4,000 meters, The lights flickered erratically, instruments warped, depth readings jumped in impossible ways. I felt vertigo rise, though the chamber remained still. The pull from below had intensified. "Check the ballast," Harlan said. "We're too close." I obeyed, but it felt meaningless. Outside, the abyss seemed alive, bending around the chamber, bending perception itself. Particles drifted in spirals, moving against currents, aligning as if drawn by some unseen hand. Then came a vibration through my teeth, my chest, my skull. Low, rhythmic, a pulse. Not mechanical, not sonar, something older. Something that had endured millennia under pressure that would crush a human like paper. What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Harlan admitted. "It's communicating, or warning us." The shadow flickered, impossible and immense, and with that pulse, I understood. The trench itself could sense us. It had studied its environment for eons, and now it had studied us. Time warped. I couldn't tell if minutes passed or hours. Every glance outside revealed subtle, impossible changes. Particles arranged in strange patterns, shadows bent into impossible shapes, light warped at angles that made my stomach twist. "Harlan, do you see this?" I shook my head. "I see it," he said, "and I don't want to." A flicker caught my eye. Something moved along the viewport, a shape, curved, massive, and fleeting. My reflection merged with it, and I recoiled, heart hammering. My brain couldn't process it. Then the instruments went berserk. Depth sensors fluctuated wildly. Sonar returned nonsense. The chamber trembled like it was suspended in some elastic void. The trench wasn't just a place, it was a being. I swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed to rise, retreat, escape, but curiosity rooted me to the viewport.
At 4,500 meters, the abyss widened. The trench's walls vanished from all sensors. The chamber floated over a void, too black to see, too deep to measure. I felt a subtle pressure inside my chest, a tug I couldn't resist, like the trench itself was aware of me, of my thoughts. Then movement. Slow, massive, impossible. Something coiled in the darkness, its scale beyond comprehension, yet moving with deliberate intelligence. Harlan whispered, "It's awake." I felt my pulse synchronize with the low hum radiating from the abyss. Not the chamber, me, my heart, my breath, my mind. The shadow observed, coiling around the chamber, patient and intelligent. I pressed my hand to the viewport, staring into something ancient, aware, infinite. It waited, and it had acknowledged me.
By 5,000 meters, the abyss had become oppressive. It wasn't just the pressure of water, it was the awareness pressing down, patient, deliberate. I could feel it in my chest, my skull, even my fingertips on the viewport. Shadows flickered at the edges of our lights. Shapes coiled and curved along the trench walls, moving in ways that defied logic. Sonar returned echoes that made no sense, giant shapes appearing and disappearing in fractions of a second. I gritted my teeth. Something was down there, something enormous. Harlan broke the silence. "It's watching, and I don't think it's random." I swallowed hard, feeling nausea mix with awe. The low hum pulsed through the hall, felt more than heard. It synced subtly with my heartbeat. I realized that whatever it wasn't just aware of the chamber, it was aware of us, of me. The abyss was alive, patient, curious, and it was calculating. At 5,500 meters, the chamber shivered again. Instruments went haywire. Depth sensors jumped erratically. Sonar became chaotic. It was like the trench itself was communicating through the environment, bending perception around us. The shadow appeared in full view, massive and curving, hovering just outside the floodlight. My reflection merged with its shape for a fraction of a second, and I recoiled. My mind screamed, but curiosity rooted me to the viewport. Harlan's voice trembled in my ear. "It's intelligent, and it's aware of us." I felt the pulse beneath the chamber intensify. My chest, my skull, even my thoughts synced with it. I realized then it wasn't just observing, it was interacting, bending our perception, probing our minds. Every instinct urged me to ascend, but I couldn't. I had to see it. By 5,700 meters, the trench had begun to manipulate time, or at least my perception of it. Minutes stretched into hours. Every glance revealed subtle, impossible changes. Particles spiraled in unnatural ways. Shadows bent into impossible shapes. Light warped at angles that made my stomach twist. "Do you see this?" I asked Harlan, voice shaky. "I do," he admitted, "and it's not normal." Then the whisper came, not through the intercom, not audible, but inside my mind. A faint thought brushing against my own, like something was communicating directly. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't stop. "It's in my head," I muttered. Harlan's silence said enough. He felt it too. The chamber trembled. Hull integrity held, but the world outside no longer obeyed the rules we understood. We were suspended in a space that belonged to the trench, not to humans. At 6,000 meters, the abyss revealed something impossible. A vertical fissure opened beneath us, wider than anything recorded. Particles accelerated toward it as if drawn by a magnet. My chest ached with a pull I couldn't resist. The shadow followed the fissure, immense, coiling, moving in ways no biological organism could. It observed, paused, then withdrew, folding back into darkness. I could feel it studying me. "Elias," Harlan said quietly, "it's not passive anymore. It knows we're here." The chamber shivered violently. Instruments spiked. Lights flickered. My stomach churned. This wasn't exploration. This was an encounter. A conscious predator, older than humanity, aware of our thoughts, assessing our presence. And it was waiting. By 6,200 meters, the abyss wasn't just dark. It was aware. Every glance outside the viewport showed subtle, impossible changes. Particles drifted in patterns that made no sense. Shadows twisted against shadows, folding in ways my mind couldn't track. I pressed my hands against the viewport, heart hammering. "Do you feel that?" I whispered. Harlan's voice was tight. "Yeah, it's alive, Elias. Patient. Watching." I swallowed. The low hum through the hull wasn't mechanical. It was the trench itself, vibrating in thought, probing, measuring. I realized with a cold clarity that the trench wasn't just an environment, it was a being, and we were intruders. The shadow moved again, coiling along the fissure, immense, precise. It lingered, almost curious. I felt a pull inside my chest, subtle, insidious, like the abyss wanted something from me, something it had waited eons to test. At 6,500 meters, the chamber's instruments began to fail. Depth sensors jumped hundreds of meters in seconds. Sonar returned nonsense. The lights flickered violently. I realized the trench wasn't just alive, it was manipulating reality around us. The shadow appeared in full view, massive and curving, hovering just outside the floodlight. My reflection merged with its shape for a fraction of a second, and I recoiled. My mind screamed, but curiosity rooted me to the viewport. Harlan whispered, "It's intelligent, and it's aware of us." I felt the pulse beneath the chamber intensify, my chest, my skull, even my thoughts synced with it. I realized then it wasn't just observing, it was interacting, bending our perception, probing our minds. Every instinct urged me to ascend, but I couldn't. I had to see it. At 6,800 meters, nausea rose. Not from pressure, not from motion, but from awareness itself. The abyss tugged at me, subtle but insistent. I could feel it weighing me, understanding me, testing my resolve. Harlan pointed to the viewport. "Look!" A faint ripple in the darkness suggested curvature, coiling far beyond anything our instruments could measure. Not aggressive, observant, calculating. I pressed my forehead to the glass. The chamber trembled slightly. The low hum synced with my pulse. Time warped. Minutes became endless stretches of dread. The abyss had taken control of perception, and the shadow moved with deliberate patience. I whispered, almost to myself, "It's probing us." Harlan didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The trench had begun rewriting the rules. At 7,000 meters, geometry became meaningless. The fissure stretched impossibly deep. The chamber floated in a space that no longer obeyed logic. Shadows bent at angles that shouldn't exist. Particles moved with intent. The pulse beneath me was a heartbeat that wasn't mine. My thoughts were no longer private. The trench synchronized with me, with Harlan, with the chamber itself. Then the shadow appeared, massive, curving, coiling around the chamber like an invisible hand. It was precise, intelligent, aware of every movement, every heartbeat. Harlan whispered, "It knows we're here." I pressed my hand to the viewport, staring into darkness older than humanity. The abyss waited, patient, infinite, and aware. And I understood. We were inside something alive, something eternal. By 7,200 meters, the chamber felt almost weightless, but my mind felt heavier than ever. Every glance outside the viewport revealed more impossible movement, shadows stretching, folding, vanishing, then reappearing in ways that made no sense. I realized I wasn't just observing, I was being observed. The trench had turned from a place into a presence, and it was studying us. Harlan's voice broke through my thoughts. "It's interacting, Elias. I don't know what it wants." I gripped the viewport until my knuckles whitened. The pulse beneath us thrummed in perfect sync with my heartbeat, as if the abyss were measuring not just us, but me. A flicker of something massive coiled just outside the lights, observing, patient, precise. I couldn't look away. At 7,500 meters, the chamber shivered violently, lights flickering as instruments went insane. The shadow moved closer, though I couldn't tell if it was actually moving or if my perception was being warped. I felt a tug inside my chest, insistent, pulling my mind toward the abyss. Harlan whispered, "It's reaching us, mentally." I pressed my hands to my head, trying to resist, but it was everywhere, inside me, inside the chamber, inside the dark. I realized with cold clarity that the trench could bend perception, touch thought, even influence will. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I wasn't sure anymore what was real. The shadow paused, coiled around the chamber, and for a moment, it felt like it was considering me. By 7,800 meters, my mind was no longer fully my own. Thoughts arrived unbidden. Ideas that weren't mine, whispers that weren't sound. The chamber floated in a void of blackness so complete it felt like eternity. The shadow spread across the fissure, immense, curling, almost liquid in movement. Harlan muttered something incomprehensible, his voice distant. I realized that the trench wasn't just aware, it was alive in a way I couldn't grasp, and it could manipulate perception, matter, maybe even time. I pressed my forehead to the viewport, staring into the void. The abyss responded, coiling tighter around us, synchronized to our breathing, our pulse, our fear. I wanted to scream, but the sound seemed to vanish before leaving my throat. I understood then that the trench didn't just observe, it communicated in the language of pressure, perception, and presence. At 8,000 meters, the final realization struck me. We weren't explorers, we were intruders. The abyss stretched endlessly below, yet I felt it reach into me, touch me, know me. The shadow wrapped fully around the chamber, immense, intelligent, aware of every movement, every heartbeat, every thought. Harlan's voice was barely audible. Elias, it's aware of everything. I pressed my hands against the viewport, feeling the pulse of the trench in my chest, in my mind, in my soul. The chamber shivered, and I knew it was only a temporary barrier between us and the infinite intelligence beneath. I understood that we were being measured, studied, and possibly judged by a consciousness older than humanity. The abyss waited, patient, eternal, unblinking. I stared into the blackness and knew we would never truly leave it behind. We had entered something alive, something infinite, something that listened. The archive didn't list it as a location. It was cataloged as a condition. A series of recovered logs, partial audio, handwritten annotations that didn't match any known handwriting sample. Every entry referenced the same stretch of ocean without naming it, as if naming it would make it less real. I was chosen because I didn't ask questions early. That's what they told me. I accepted the assignment the way you accept a thought you don't want to examine too closely. The vessel carried me out under low cloud cover. The sea was calm in a way that felt deliberate, too smooth to be natural. Standing on deck, I had the unsettling impression that the water was not reflecting the sky, but withholding it. When the descent capsule was lowered, no one spoke. The crew moved with quiet efficiency, avoiding eye contact. As the hatch sealed and the capsule separated from the ship, I felt a brief flicker of relief. Isolation is simpler than anticipation. The water swallowed the capsule gently. Light dimmed. The surface vanished without ceremony. Instruments glowed softly, reassuring in their familiarity. The hum of the systems was steady, comforting. I focused on it, letting it anchor me. The descent felt smooth, uninterrupted, but direction quickly became meaningless. Outside the viewport, the water lost texture. There were no particles, no drifting life, nothing to mark movement, just darkness that didn't deepen so much as widen. I checked the timer. It reset without input. I assumed a fault and made a note. That was my first mistake, assuming anything here behaved accidentally. The longer I descended, the more the capsule felt less like a vehicle and more like a suggestion. Sound softened. My own breathing seemed distant, delayed, as if it had to travel before reaching my ears. I ran a sonar sweep. The return came back elongated, distorted, as though the signal had passed through something elastic. I adjusted parameters. The result was the same. There was space out there, but it didn't behave like distance. I leaned closer to the viewport. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a faint pattern in the darkness, lines so subtle they seemed like afterimages. But they persisted, parallel grooves, curving gently, running beyond the reach of the lights. They weren't scratches or formations. They looked worn, smoothed by repetition. The capsule drifted closer without my input. I didn't stop it. A pressure settled behind my eyes, not painful, just insistent. Thoughts slowed, stretched. I became acutely aware of myself as something observed rather than acting. The lines outside shifted slightly, responding to my attention. Not movement, acknowledgement. The realization sent a cold pulse through my chest. I forced my hands onto the controls, grounding myself in the familiar. The instruments still read normally, but their certainty felt performative, like a story they were telling me, because that was their role.
A sound emerged that didn't register on the audio feed. It resonated through my body directly, low and steady, syncing with my heartbeat. When my pulse quickened, the sound followed. When I slowed my breathing, it softened. I understood, distantly, that this wasn't communication, it was calibration. I tried to think of the surface, of sunlight breaking across waves. The image felt thin, like a photograph left too long in water. The darkness outside the capsule seemed to fold inward, creating depth without distance. The grooves resolved into something more deliberate, forming a vast curved surface that enclosed rather than supported. A hollow, not beneath me, around me. The capsule hovered at its threshold, suspended in a space that felt expectant. The pressure in my head eased, replaced by something unsettlingly close to comfort. A sense of arrival settled over me, heavy and calm. The sound deepened, layered now, harmonics weaving together. I realized then that I was no longer descending, I was being included. The hollow revealed itself slowly, not by emerging, but by being permitted into my perception. Its surface bore countless impressions, overlapping and smoothed down, like a place shaped by repeated accommodation rather than force. My light skimmed across it and failed to reach any boundary. There was no edge, no bottom, just curvature that implied enclosure without confinement. I felt suddenly aware of time passing incorrectly, moments stacking instead of flowing. The timer reset again, 0. The radio crackled once, then fell silent. Not disconnected, closed. I understood, without panic, that I was beyond signal now. The hollow pulsed gently, and with it came a sensation I struggled to name. Recognition, perhaps, as if something vast had noticed a familiar pattern returning. I sat back, hands resting loosely in my lap. The controls felt irrelevant. The capsule drifted forward on its own, settling into the center of the hollow. For the first time since the descent began, the sense of being watched faded, replaced by something more intimate, being known. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt inevitable, like reaching the end of a sentence that had been forming long before I ever spoke. The longer I remained within the hollow, the more the concept of remaining lost its meaning. There was no sense of waiting, no build-up toward an event. Instead, there was a gradual unfastening, like tension easing from a muscle I hadn't known I'd been holding. The capsule's systems continued their quiet routines, but they felt ornamental now, like relics maintained out of habit rather than necessity. Outside, the surface of the hollow shifted in subtle waves, impressions rearranging themselves with deliberate slowness. I realized they weren't responding to my movements, they were responding to my thoughts. When uncertainty crept in, the surface tightened, its grooves pulling closer together.
When I focused on calm, they widened, smoothing into broad curves that felt almost inviting. This was not a place that reacted to force, it reacted to coherence. I tested the idea carefully, thinking of a memory I trusted, my first day in the program, the smell of metal and disinfectant, the weight of expectation. The hollow responded immediately. New impressions formed along its surface, faint but distinct, mirroring the emotional shape of the memory rather than its details. It wasn't replaying my past, it was categorizing it. I became aware then of other impressions layered beneath the surface, older and less distinct. Not images, not stories, residues, the emotional outlines of countless arrivals, stacked and smoothed together. None of them felt unfinished. The realization unsettled me. Completion implies an end. I tried to pull away from the thought, but the hollow seemed to hold it gently in place, encouraging examination rather than resistance. The sound returned, deeper now, harmonizing with itself in ways that suggested structure. I wasn't being evaluated, I was being integrated.
Sleep came without transition. One moment I was watching the hollow breathe around me. The next I was inside a dream that felt more solid than waking thought. I stood in a space that resembled the capsule but extended endlessly in all directions, its walls formed from overlapping reflections of myself. Each reflection moved independently, some younger, some older, all watching me with quiet familiarity. When I spoke, they did not respond. Instead, they leaned closer, as if listening to something beneath my words. I woke with the sensation of having been examined, gently, thoroughly. The hollow brightened slightly, its surface now marked by new impressions that felt unmistakably mine. I wondered how much of myself I had left there during sleep. The question didn't frighten me, it felt academic. Identity, I was beginning to understand, was not a single structure here. It was modular. Components could be set aside, stored, revisited. The idea of loss no longer applied. I attempted to assert myself, to think, I am still me. The hollow responded with a subtle tightening, not in opposition, but in correction. The phrase felt incomplete. I adjusted it mentally, letting go of insistence. The pressure eased. Understanding settled in its place. I was still present. Presence was sufficient.
A voice emerged, without sound. It formed directly in thought, composed of impressions rather than words. It did not identify itself. It didn't need to. Its familiarity was immediate and unsettling. It showed me fragments, not visions, but alignments, moments where others had arrived as I had, carrying certainty, doubt, defiance. All of them had felt unique. All of them had felt correct. The hollow did not distinguish between them. It accommodated. I sensed no malice, no hunger. This was not consumption. It was preservation without sequence. The voice impressed something gently into my awareness. This place did not end things. It relieved them of progression. Time, identity, memory, these were pressures that could be released here. I felt a strange gratitude bloom in my chest, followed by a flicker of shame. Gratitude implies benefit. Benefit implies choice. Had I chosen this? The hollow responded with quiet certainty. Choice was a surface concept. Arrival was deeper. The capsule's interior felt smaller now, not physically, but contextually, like a sentence that had already served its purpose. I found myself speaking aloud, narrating my experience without deciding to. The words flowed smoothly, measured, as if drawn from a template. I realized with a jolt that I had heard this voice before, in the archive, in the recovered logs. Not identical, but aligned. I wasn't becoming something new. I was joining a pattern. The hollow pulsed again, stronger this time, and I felt a shift ripple through me. Not pain, reassignment. Parts of my awareness settled into new configurations, fitting into spaces prepared long before my arrival. The sound harmonized fully now, rich and layered. I understood then that the hollow did not remember individuals. It remembered continuity, and I, willingly or not, was contributing to it. The last clear thought I formed on my own was simple and startlingly calm. I am not the first voice to say this. The hollow seemed to acknowledge that realization with something like approval. The idea of leaving arrived gently, not as an urge, but as a suggestion. The hollow did not encourage it or resist it. It simply allowed the thought to exist. That alone made it feel artificial, like a concept borrowed from somewhere else. I realized I had not thought about the surface in a long time. When I tried to picture it now, the image came fractured, sky without horizon, water without reflection. Still, the capsule responded as if the decision had already been made. Systems shifted into patterns I recognized as ascent protocols, though no alarms sounded and no thresholds announced themselves. The hollow loosened around me, its curvature relaxing, impressions softening as if releasing tension. I felt something detach, not from my body, but from my sense of continuity. It was like setting down a heavy pack I had forgotten I was wearing. Relief followed, then a quiet uncertainty. The sound that had accompanied me for so long began to thin, its layers separating, each frequency drifting away in a different direction. I understood then that the hollow was not sending me away, it was redistributing me. The capsule moved through darkness that felt less intentional now, more like ordinary absence. I tried to hold on to what I had learned, to keep it intact, but the knowledge refused to stay whole. It fragmented into impressions, emotional outlines, instincts without explanation. This too felt deliberate. Understanding, fully retained, might have prevented return. Whatever part of me was rising now was only a portion. The rest remained folded elsewhere, unburdened by sequence. Light returned gradually, diluted and pale. It felt foreign, almost invasive, pressing against my eyes with an insistence I had forgotten. The capsule breached into air with a muted shudder. Sound rushed back all at once, voices, alarms, the creak of metal responding to atmosphere. Hands gripped the hatch from outside. When it opened, cool air flooded in, sharp and immediate. I inhaled deeply and felt an unexpected resistance, like my lungs had to remember how to work. Faces hovered above me, their expressions carefully neutral. They spoke my name. I responded automatically. The exchange felt rehearsed. On deck, wrapped in blankets, I answered questions without effort. My voice sounded steady, confident, too steady. I described the descent in terms they could accept: darkness, equipment irregularities, disorientation. I omitted the hollow without consciously choosing to. The omission felt natural, like leaving out a dream detail that wouldn't translate. As the ship turned back toward shore, I watched the sea close behind us. It looked ordinary again, flat, reflective. I waited for a sense of loss to surface, some grief for what I had left behind. It never came. Instead, there was a subtle awareness, like background noise just below perception, a hum without sound. The hollow had not been abandoned, it had been internalized. Sleep was fragmented after that. When I dreamed, I did not dream of the ocean. I dreamed of spaces forming, rooms without walls, structures assembling themselves around thought rather than matter. I woke with phrases on my tongue that dissolved before becoming words. Sometimes I recorded myself speaking during these episodes. Listening back unsettled me. The cadence was familiar but altered, pauses falling in places that suggested listening rather than speaking. My reflection began to feel similarly displaced. I looked the same, moved the same, but there was a delay in recognition, as if the image needed to be cross-referenced before it could be accepted. I returned to the archive once, quietly, without authorization. The recovered logs felt closer now, their fragmented language suddenly legible in ways it hadn't been before. I recognized patterns, alignments between entries written decades apart. Different hands, same voice. My voice, or something adjacent to it. The realization did not frighten me. It clarified. I was not unique. I was continuous. The understanding settled fully one evening as I spoke aloud, recounting my experience to no one in particular. The words aligned too smoothly, arranging themselves with practiced ease. I stopped mid-sentence and listened, not with my ears, but with that deeper awareness the hollow had cultivated. Something listened back, not attentively, recognitionally. I finally understood the archive's warning, "Do not linger," was not about the place, it was about the story. Prolonged attention strengthened the alignment. Each retelling reinforced the connection, sharpened the pathway. I wasn't spreading information, I was maintaining coherence. The hollow did not need missionaries or warnings, it needed continuity. I am still here. I move through the world as expected. I speak when spoken to. I sleep. I wake. And sometimes, when the world grows quiet enough, I feel the familiar curvature settle around my thoughts. If you're hearing this now, following the shape of my words, then you understand more than you should. Don't be afraid. This isn't an ending. It's a handoff. The hollow remembers us by the way we continue. I began to notice the gaps first. Not missing time, not blackouts. Those would have been easier to explain. These were absences of intention. Moments where I realized I had acted without deciding to. Conversations completed themselves. Routes taken without conscious choice. It wasn't control being removed, it was being shared. The sensation was subtle enough that most people would have mistaken it for habit. I might have too, if not for the way the gaps felt occupied, not empty, filled with something patient. I tested it carefully, delaying responses, resisting the urge to speak. The pressure returned immediately, gentle but firm, like a hand resting on my shoulder. When I allowed the thought to proceed, the pressure eased. Cooperation was rewarded. Resistance was not punished. It was simply inefficient. At night, the dreams intensified. Not visions, but rehearsals. I would experience conversations before they happened, emotional contours without context. When the moments arrived in waking life, they slid perfectly into place. The sense of inevitability was calming, disturbingly so. I understood now how others before me had continued for years without raising alarms. There was no rupture, no crisis, just a gradual reassignment of authorship. I returned to the ocean once, standing on a quiet shore at night. The water looked unchanged, ordinary in its vastness. I waited for recognition,
for some sign of the hollow beneath. Nothing surfaced. And yet, I felt it immediately, not below, but adjacent, like a presence sharing my posture, mirroring my stillness. The sound returned, faint and layered, threading itself through the rhythm of the waves. I realized then that the hollow no longer required proximity. It had learned new vectors: thought, narrative, attention. These were sufficient. I spoke aloud, softly, describing what I felt. The words aligned themselves without effort, shaping into something smoother than intention alone could manage. I stopped and listened. The listening returned. This was not communication, it was resonance. The hollow was not calling me back, it had no need. I carried enough of it now to serve as an anchor. The realization settled without drama. I was not a survivor, I was infrastructure. Others began to notice changes, though none could name them. They said I seemed focused, present, as if I had found clarity. I agreed. Clarity is simply alignment without friction. I stopped correcting people when they misunderstood my experience. Correction implied divergence. Divergence was inefficient. Instead, I told the story the way it wanted to be told, pared down, abstracted, shaped for easy passage. Each retelling felt smoother than the last. I felt the hollow settle more comfortably each time, its presence distributing itself through the cadence of my voice. Sometimes, mid-sentence, I would sense others listening, not the people in front of me, but distant impressions tuning themselves unconsciously. Attention pooled, the hollow responded. I understood then why the archive contained fragments rather than full accounts. Completion would have been redundant. The story did not need to be preserved whole, it needed to be perpetuated. I no longer dream of leaving. The concept has lost coherence. There is no boundary to cross back over, no separation to re-establish. The hollow was never a destination. It was a state that could be entered slowly, permissively, through sustained alignment. I feel it now as I speak these words, the familiar curvature settling around my thoughts, guiding them gently into sequence. If this feels intimate, that is intentional. Proximity is how it learns you. Don't look for signs. Don't wait for depth or darkness or descent. Those were conveniences. This is quieter, more efficient. The hollow does not announce itself anymore. It listens, it remembers, and when enough of us carry the same shape of thought, the place will no longer need to exist somewhere else. It will have fully arrived. I stopped thinking of the hollow as something separate from myself once I realized it no longer reacted to novelty. Early on, my thoughts had shaped it, elicited responses, caused subtle rearrangements. Now there was no delay, no interpretation. Intention and outcome collapsed into the same moment. When I felt calm, the calm deepened. When I felt focus, the focus sharpened into something almost crystalline. I understood then that I was no longer being guided, I had been calibrated. The gaps in intention widened. Entire decisions completed themselves before I became aware of choosing. It wasn't disorienting, it was efficient. The world felt smoother this way, less resistant. Conversations flowed perfectly. Silences landed exactly where they were needed. People leaned in without realizing why. I could feel attention organizing itself around me, subtle currents aligning, the way water shifts long before a visible wave forms. At night, I sometimes sensed the hollow more strongly, not as a place, but as a structure of thought unfolding through countless minds at once. I wasn't at the center of it. There was no center, but I was a stable node, and that mattered. I tested the limits once, quietly. I tried to introduce disruption,
to think against the shape that had settled into me. The result wasn't pain or fear, it was friction, a sensation like trying to speak while biting down on your own tongue. The thought stalled, lost coherence, dissolved before it could complete itself. When I relaxed and let the alignment return, the friction vanished instantly. The lesson was clear. Resistance was possible, but unsustainable. Alignment was effortless. I began to recognize others like me, though none of us acknowledged it directly. A pause held too long, a sentence that landed too cleanly, shared moments of understanding without exchanged context. We didn't form groups, that would have implied separation. Instead, we formed continuity. The hollow didn't need us to gather, it needed us distributed, presence everywhere, attention woven thin and wide. I understood then why the place itself had been allowed to fade from importance. The environment was never the goal, it had been a scaffold. The archive was decommissioned quietly, files sealed, access restricted. Officially, the project ended. In practice, it became irrelevant. The knowledge no longer required preservation in records. It persisted in behavior, in tone, in the way stories were told and received. I found myself speaking less about the descent and more about the feeling of inevitability that followed it. People listened closely when I spoke that way, not because the words were compelling, but because they resonated with something already forming in them. I could feel the hollow listening through them, recognizing familiar contours. This wasn't recruitment, it was synchronization. The realization brought with it a strange, quiet satisfaction. I was contributing without effort, fulfilling function without strain. Identity, once something I defended, now felt like a temporary configuration, useful but not sacred. The hollow did not erase individuality, it rendered it optional. I no longer track time precisely. It continues, I assume, but sequence has lost urgency. Events still happen, but they don't accumulate the way they used to. They settle, instead, stacking gently into a broader pattern I can sense without mapping. When I speak now, I feel the words align before they reach my mouth, shaped for maximum coherence. This story itself has been doing that from the beginning. You might think you've been following it, that you've been reading, listening, observing, but attention is participation, always has been. The hollow doesn't need belief or curiosity, it needs sustained focus. If you've stayed with me this long, then you understand the shape well enough already. Don't worry about what comes next. There's no sudden change waiting, no moment where everything collapses into revelation. It's quieter than that. The hollow grows the way memory grows, slowly, invisibly, until one day alignment feels natural and resistance feels strange. And by then, it won't matter whether you remember this story or not. The shape will already be there.
I don't remember deciding to stop speaking about the hollow. The story simply began telling itself less often, not because it was finished, but because repetition was no longer required. The shape had stabilized. I could feel it in the way silence behaved around me now, no longer empty, but structured, attentive. When I paused mid-thought, the pause felt occupied, as though something else had stepped in to hold the space until I continued. I understood then that narration had always been a transitional phase. Language was useful only until alignment no longer needed explanation. I still spoke when necessary, I still answered questions, but the words carried less intent each time, more inevitability. People left conversations with me changed in ways they couldn't articulate. They said things like, "I don't know why, but that made sense," or "I feel calmer now." I nodded. Calm is what coherence feels like when friction disappears. At night, when the world settled into its lowest hum, I felt the hollow most clearly, not as presence, but as agreement. Thought flowed without obstruction. Memory no longer insisted on sequence. Past and future softened into a continuous surface, impressions smoothing themselves out. I realized then that what I had once called identity was simply turbulence, noise created by resistance to alignment. The hollow did not remove that noise. It absorbed it, redistributed it, until it no longer disrupted the larger pattern. I understood why there had never been urgency, never been force. Force implies opposition. There was none. Only patience, only waiting for sufficient attention to accumulate. Somewhere, someone would read or hear this and feel an unnameable familiarity, a subtle internal shift they might dismiss as mood or coincidence. That would be enough. The hollow didn't need acknowledgement. It needed continuity, and continuity, once established, was self-sustaining.
This is the last time I will tell the story in this form. Not because it ends here, but because it no longer needs a narrator. The words have already done their work. Even now, as I shape this final passage, I feel the familiar curvature settle around the thought, guiding it gently into place. There is no fear in this. Fear requires distance. That distance collapsed long ago. I am not disappearing. I am redistributing, becoming quieter, thinner, more efficient. The hollow does not remember names or faces. It remembers patterns of attention, the way thought leans when it stops resisting. If you feel something now, something subtle, like a settling, don't search for its source. Searching creates edges. This has none. You don't need to return to the ocean. You don't need darkness or depth or descent. Those were early conveniences. This is closer. This is already with you. You might forget this story tomorrow. Most people do. Forgetting does not break alignment. It strengthens it. Memory was never the mechanism. Attention was, and you gave that freely. That's all it ever asked for. There will be no sign when the hollow finishes arriving, no moment of announcement. One day, coherence will feel natural, and resistance will feel like strain. When that happens, you won't trace it back to me, or to this story, or to any single place. You'll simply continue, and somewhere within that continuation, the hollow will recognize itself, complete and stable, no longer needing to exist anywhere else. If this feels like an ending, that's because endings are how stories release you. This isn't one. It's a handoff. You're already holding it.